there is a new, I believe, or maybe it's not so new, a new term that I've been hearing, a new acronym. It's vulnerability, uncertainty, chaos, and ambiguity. I have my colleagues, Ken Hackshaw and Kellee Ann Richards St, both risk management consultants, joining me to discuss our current situation and the way forward and what we can do to make the most right now. So any thoughts? Because Minister Lewis just really highlighted the element of vulnerability, and that is not something that we can do much about. But we go from here, given that we are in a situation that seems to some actually a little bit hopeless, because we have financial impact on a large sector of our population, and a large, significant number of businesses are in a life or death situation right now. They are in survival mode. They're very vulnerable. How do we deal with it in a situation that is chaotic, ambiguous, and uncertain? Ken, you want to take that?
Yeah, and you know, I was heartened, enlightened, and comforted by the contributions of Minister Gonzalez. It's as a risk practitioner who have been doing this for a bit, I wouldn't say how long. The Caribbean, risk management in the Caribbean is obviously not as robust as it should be. The leaders, in my respectful view, aren't as risk intelligent as they ought to be, and there are many reasons for that. So no, you know, I'm not casting a very wide net with this, but there are exceptions. But through no fault of their own, many of the leaders now who were educated were never risk educated. You know, so as qualified as they are, and I know many doctors and engineers, great as they are, when we start speaking of risk management, you know, the dots, they know the term, but the dots don't connect. So when I heard Minister Gonzalez speak of what needs to be done, my fervent hope is that that gets emulated across all other ministries, and I dare say across the Caribbean, because if that disruption does not take place, Caribbean nations will be in a hold pattern. You know, when we're talking about runway, that plane needs to move down that risk management runway. We have been in that hold pattern for too long, and so again, it's comforting that Minister Lewis is taking on that mantle. I remember the very first conversation I had with him, and you guys would have heard me say this, that you literally have to step on some toes to constructively disrupt. And once he has that buy-in from his fellow ministers and the Prime Minister, I think, no, I don't think, I know these institutions will be better for it. And again, that's where the academy comes in. That's where the Trinidad and Tobago Risk Management Institute. We have a significant role to play in that regard, because as you would have mentioned, Natasha, I think we are at the forefront of driving the disciplines of risk management through the Caribbean. So, and though there are many setbacks, because if decision makers can think it, they can act on it. So we aren't only risk practitioners, we also have to be sales managers. We have to continuously sell this, or sell the value of, say, enterprise risk management. And Dr. Hardy spoke eloquently about what needs to be done, and what enterprise risk management is not, and what it ought to be. And I kind of look forward to the challenges ahead of us. And if we have more ministers like Minister Lewis from Bahamas, Minister Gonzalez from Trinidad and Tobago, if we could get more of the decision makers aligned with that thinking, I think the Caribbean nations will be poised to both, build out their resilient capacity, reduce their vulnerabilities, grow and expand the economies, and so it's a necessity. It's not just a business imperative now to integrate risk management into the people, the processes, and systems of the Caribbean nations.
Thanks for that, Ken. I would like to now ask my colleague Kellee Ann. We've been delivering a program, a professional certificate in enterprise risk management for, is it on more than 2 years now? And
4 years, eh?
Oh my goodness, how time flies. In doing this program, Kellee is one of the lecturers and facilitators on the program. I like to think while I teach, I actually learn just as much as some of the participants. How are we, with what we are doing, really making a difference? Are we making any difference? Because Minister Hiram Lewis, spoke to education as one of the ways that we can practice hazard mitigation. As an educator, sometimes I wonder if I'm really making a difference. Kellee, what are your thoughts? Are we having an impact? Is risk management really becoming part of our management tool set, or is it still nice to talk about? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, and I would like the audience to know that I lecture enterprise risk management in a global environment. And one of my key takeaways when I'm liaising with students is really I have an important role in terms of adjusting their mindset. Because historically, a lot of them, via their experience, may have a two-dimensional relationship with risk, right? Karen would have alluded to that. There are customary conversations about likelihood and impact. But if you remember the bedrock on risk management, looking at uncertainty, that impact of uncertainty, that objective, then we tend to have a different conversation because we're now looking at competitive advantage. You're now having conversations in terms of how you place your product, where you should place your product. And therefore, you're having a three-dimensional conversation because you're not just looking at the loan risk. You're now going to be asking questions. And some of the key things I try to drive home to students is the information is all around you. Data is the new currency. And don't just treat social media and news headlines as just an opportunity to create the next popular meme. News headlines tell a story. And they're telling us what are the emerging risks happening in different territories. And if you would step back and be a little bit more analytical in how we view these headlines, we would now be able to see, it'll be at our fingertips, how we're able to manage risk in our environment. So I remember back in one class, I was going through the top 10 global risks. And back then, I think it was 2018, one of the top 10 risks was weapons of mass destruction. And the students asked, well, okay, you're in a Caribbean class. How could that possibly have any impact on the Caribbean? And I mentioned to them that, listen, the Caribbean relies on remittances from foreign territories. That's a big part of our GDP in the Caribbean. When our family members migrate and they send money home, that's a big part of our GDP, as well as our banking systems that relies on US currency. So any war that breaks out in any particular territory, and the US is involved, or Europe is involved, or the key demand centers like China, which a lot of economies are relying on to sell their goods, then you in Trinidad need to pay attention, right? Even owning a website, there are responsibilities now with owning a website to have a blog, more so than it was 10 years ago. Now you have to consider if someone on your reading list is from Europe or US, you now need to consider GDPR, these data privacy laws, and you now have to be clear to them and ask their permission. Can you use their email address? Can you collect data on them? And there are hefty fines for not managing data. We have seen Facebook being fined millions of dollars for not protecting their customers' privacy and information. So we have an opportunity, this conference offers us an opportunity to change our mindset.
There are two things, Kellee Ann, that you mentioned that I want to just explore a little bit more. And you talk about changing mindsets and the importance of education as well as data privacy. In our second panel this afternoon, we're going to be talking about technology-related risks and impact on innovation and how it can leverage that growth that we want for coming out of our current situation. So we're going to explore that a little bit more. But more importantly, what we can talk about here, and I mean, you can start, Kellee Ann, by sharing on it. One of the programs that is still in the development stage right now that we are currently finalizing and hope to roll out next year is a risk management fundamentals for secondary school students and young adults.
Yep.
Talking about decision-making skills and how we have to pivot from the two-dimensional and thinking about risk as only applying to certain things. Risk applies to finance, risk applies to insurance, and really appreciate that, no, risk actually applies to everything that we do. There's risk in sports, there's risk in entertainment, there's risk in, if you think about it right now, our entertainment sector or hospitality sectors, who could have imagined, there was a time, and I think people may still say so, where they say, owning a bar is like printing money. What's happening to the bars now? Who could have? I have often thought about opening a bar myself, but anyway, so there are no certainties. And really what we want to get to is that anything is possible and accepting that, even though we like to think that God is a Trini or God is a West Indian, and nothing bad will ever happen to some of us. We really believe that. But that is not a basis for intelligent decision-making. It's not a basis for risk-intelligent decision-making. We want to start really introducing our young people to that. So there was a time when critical thinking was the new thing to discuss and to really rave about, introducing young people to critical thinking. Critical thinking, how far does it take us?
No.
The era of misinformation, Kellee Ann, you also refer to us being a little more astute in how we use social media. Right now, it is extraordinarily difficult, even for someone who may consider themselves otherwise intelligent, to tell what is true and what is not true. How do we, one, select appropriate information, and two, use that information to develop scenarios and analyze that scenario to say, well, this is where we want to go. These are our objectives and our goals. And you know what? Here are some of the assumptions that we're making. Enter risk management. Are we going to that point? And shouldn't we? When you want to buy a car, are we just going to walk down the road, see a car and say, hey, I like that. Let me just call my bank and get a check. We don't. When you want to do anything that you are invested in, you start to think about it. You start to think about criteria. You start to think about, well, what if something happens? Enter risk management. So it's a part of your life. So I'd like to invite Ken to talk a little bit more about risk management program we are developing for young adults, which we hope to use the proceeds of the conference today to actually support. Ken.
Yeah, and that's that. Those are very interesting analogies, examples that you have just mentioned, Natasha. And so when we speak of uncertainties, and if you go back to the example that you referenced, we want to buy a car, or I want to buy a car, one needs to be concerned with the uncertainty that matters to them to begin with, because my uncertainty wouldn't necessarily be yours, depending on what our objectives are. On the organizational or the country level, then those individual uncertainties become cumulative. But before we go there, a couple of years ago, well, 2 years ago, I would often be asked, how long would it take for the Caribbean or Trinidad and Tobago to get to a certain level of risk intelligence? And I oftentimes would say 2 generations. And born out of those conversations was, okay, how do we then mitigate that risks? And so here we are. We have developed a workshop around, I call it fundamentals of risk management for secondary students, because the inculcating risk or integrating risk into the psyche, call it the DNA, the mindset of our future leaders is almost critical at this stage. And education is a fundamental part of countries and islands future-proofing themselves, because if you can't think it, you can't act on it. And one of the deficiencies, respectfully, to most of our leaders, because they were never actually trained in risk management, nor was it really that formal back in the day. So that deficiency still resides there. And so training, educating, and you're spot on, Natasha, critical thinking is critical thinking. But when you can look, one of the analogies I like to use is, if it's not like having a crystal ball, but if you can apply the concept of risk analysis or and risk measurement. So yeah, that is a potential risk to me, but where does it scale in terms of all of the other risk or uncertainties? So unless you have a capacity or some knowledge as to how to do that, then we will always be, you know, behind the eight ball from the education standpoint. And I want to share one last point before Kellee jumps in. One of the speakers coming up later on the panel is Dr. Kirk Douglas, out of the University of the West Indies. And in having a meeting with him, I was so struck by a comment he made. He said, we are so concerned, countries are so concerned with protecting their borders, that we don't focus too much on protecting our own individual borders. And as a risk practitioner, and I'm a lifelong learner when it comes to risk, I immediately started writing. And as he was speaking, I'm looking at the doors and windows, and I'm saying, yeah. And again, he is in biosecurity, biodiversity. And so one of the windows was ajar, and he says, well, these are pathogens and germs and stuff get in. So I am at risk because I'm not protecting my individual borders. Now, that is where risk education comes in. So we're going to take all of that, and more so the psychology of risk, where we talk about behaviors and attitudes. And I want to thank Natasha, because my thinking was just secondary school. Natasha introduced and said, no, we need to expand that. What about educating the vulnerable students or young adults? And so we have added that element to it. And I also learned that music is a nice way of, you know, moving information across individuals or students that are challenged. So those are aspects of the training platform that we'll be putting together. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I hope that most of us who are listening will want to contribute in some way. And these are voluntary stuff. Yeah? So if I may, most of the proceeds from this conference will go in pushing that fundamentals of risk management program into secondary schools. And we have had really, really good response from secondary schools in that regard. So Kellee, what do you want to add to that?
So can you remember that old acid wash sheet, as in some old bag that you don't wear anymore? I would like us to consider that risk management is no longer about mitigating against them.
True.
Risk management is about making constructive decisions.
Correct.
Risk-based decision making. And therefore, when we are going about making a decision, we first have to consider what are our value objectives. Right?
Right.
If I'm working in the energy sector, maybe safety is ranking in terms of my value objectives. And how I go about approving projects is going to be informed by those value objectives, right? How we position ourselves, our values. Do we want to be operating in sanctioned countries? Do we want to be purchasing products from suppliers who maybe have underage workers? That all comes back to our values and how we view risk within our organization. I think Karen would have mentioned that, right? What is our risk policy, right? The key term speaks about risk appetite. What are the boundaries that the enterprise must operate within. So Natasha would have asked the question about social media. And we have to view our organizations or our persons as our kids as our prized possession. And when you have a prized possession, you put several layers of barriers to ensure that nothing happens to your prized possession. And therefore, we have to treat how we manage our enterprises almost like a castle. If you look at how a castle is constructed, there's the moat, and there's the outer barriers and the inner barriers. There are different layers of defenses that protect the inhabitants of that castle area from threat. But there are also opportunities. So there are parts of that castle where you can look beyond and see whether you have a guest come in. You can see whether you have an emerging issue happening. And it keeps you informed, but also it gives you an opportunity to be forearmed in terms of how you manage your business enterprise, in terms of how you manage your family affairs, and overall in terms of how you structure or position yourself to maximize the opportunities that your organization could take. And that's where the mindset has to set in. Oftentimes we read about these failures in the newspapers and it flies over us. We don't look for what are the lessons. And there are several lessons for the Caribbean, especially with COVID, when the issue of deglobalization, everyone now looking at energy security, realizing that, listen, if you're not a superpower, you may be last on the list for vaccines, which is an issue here. How do you go about allocating vaccines? How would you be ranked in accessing it? Getting ventilators, getting PPE to protect you during a pandemic. That was an issue. And we realized that, listen, we need to be more self-sufficient in terms of how we manage our agricultural resources and how we manage our energy resources, especially if you're dependent on trade. So these are the conversations that we need to have, and we now have to have a three-dimensional mindset in how we are going about our affairs now. And things are accelerating. So it means that we have to be agile in terms of how we are taking on the global affairs.
Right, and great point. Let me just jump back in real quick. I want to. Natasha gave us a really good analogy about bar owners, and so that's one of the speakers later on is Chrissy Hopkinson or Hyper, and that will speak to some of these things. And we also have someone from the entrepreneurial space in Stephanie Pemberton, because you know, risks are not unique to the conglomerates or the big businesses. It is the mom and pops. It's you, it's me. So when I say uncertainty, again, it's just the uncertainty that matters. And I've said this a couple of times the last couple of days, that when we speak about the economies of the Caribbean, we aren't speaking about necessarily the economies of the government or the large institutions. It's the economy of Natasha, Kelly, me, and anyone here listening. You know, what is your economy about? What are the risks, both positive and negative? You know, the threats and the opportunities. How can you start a business and monetize a passion or a skill set that you have in these times? So some analysis needs to be done. I want to quote. I want to reference one of I would call him a colleague. He's one of the few exceptions in the government space. He chairs up. He's the chairman of a board, and he just sent a note, a comment reminding me that enterprise risk management exists in the government of Trinidad and Tobago. But what is required is practitioners or folks to push it through or to operationalize it. That's very true. So in the Trinidad and Tobago government, by the way of the performance monitoring manual, they reference that this is what needs to happen, though it doesn't necessarily happen. But I need us to take a step further. If we go back to Minister Lewis's comments about legislating around risk management. In Jamaica, they have acts that speaks to enterprise risk management and governance around risk management. Many of the other island territories or governments is lacking in that regard. They need to have legislation around this, because if we leave it up to some decision makers, nothing will come out of it. Oh, well, I shouldn't say nothing, but it will take much longer. So I do appreciate that reminder, Mr. Herbert George. So Kelly is right again. It is all about making good decisions. Risk management is not a panacea. It's not fait accompli. Bad things will still happen, but it does help you with data coming out of your analyses helps inform better decisions. Natasha.
I think that reminder, yes, it's important for us to acknowledge that there is a recognition of the importance and the potential impact of risk management, and it has been around for a while. However, we also acknowledge that there are but a few that are in the state sector that are actually practicing effective risk management or actually taking it seriously. Because as consultants, we have the sometimes very frustrating experience of being invited to do projects or programs within an organization to develop, to help them design and implement ERM frameworks, policies, and so on, only to be rather disappointed that the approach within the organization is, okay, we tick this box, we did this, we were told we had to, we did it. And there was no real appreciation or acceptance that this is something that really needed to be within the organization, embedded and changed, and people needed to get uncomfortable. So I want to toss it back to you, Ken, with respect to the statement that is sometimes made that risk management is for the auditors. So we have a policy, we have a framework, but that's not my job. The auditors handle risk management.
Yeah, and so I have a maxim that goes like this: risk and audit can live together, but they cannot sleep together. My colleagues Natasha and Kellee here are always trying to keep me along that path of political correctness. Good luck with that one. I'm not warm and fuzzy about the, if I could, it's the Auditor Generals of the governments across the Caribbean. If I could speak specifically about the one in Trinidad and Tobago, they are too finance focused. Though they are moving in a different direction, but it should not all be about the numbers. I'm coming in to check your books. No, many things go wrong to affect the finances of a state enterprise, of a mom and pop store, of a major conglomerate. Some things, operations go wrong. If it goes well, then you make a profit. If it goes bad, well, notwithstanding any external factors. But audit and risk must coexist. It must be harmonized. They must work in tandem to effect and to deliver on the mandates. They cannot work in silos, and you ought not to have audit doing risks and risks doing audits. It's not best practice, and then you must also include the personalities involved with the folks who are doing these audits and these risk assessments when we talk about the psychology of risks. So, and so having an internal audit department does not mitigate or does not identify, does not address the risks to the organization. Yes, we could talk about risk-based audit. Yeah, but there's need for having risk practitioners, audit professionals, if you want to deliver on your mandates timely, efficiently, less with less expense. So we must connect the dots. We must harmonize. We must integrate. All of that leads to better decisions. Once you have that data coming in from both sources, that is almost nirvana there. So yeah, and I don't think the state enterprises across the Caribbean, based on my conversations and my work, aren't there yet. My hope is, that's where the academy and the institute comes in. We have a role to play, and I hope that they call on us to assist them in that regard. Natasha.
Thank you very much, Ken. You're right. We don't necessarily always agree with you, and tell you so. That's the beauty of management in a company where it is okay to disagree and fail, because that in itself, disagreement at an executive level, is a form of risk management. So it is not something that should be discouraged. It's something that you have to get used to, but again, the culture of our countries and the culture of management and boards in small economies in particular, it's difficult to bring the mindset of regular challenge and disagreement, meaningful challenge and disagreement. So that's another takeaway we can have from today. Kellee, with respect to the education, when we're talking about risk and audit, are we talking about changing and transforming organizations? We need also to think about how we promote the education within companies. What has been your experience, again, balancing your interactions with the persons that we have in the professional certificate program, which we deliver in collaboration with the Arthur Lockjaw Global School of Business, as well as your professional work life? How are we doing with respect to embedding risk education in our working organizations? What more can be done to help transform the organization and the culture within?
Yes, and there's definitely more work that needs to be done. I think sometimes in our Caribbean mindset and can't set it all the time, this whole concept that it can't happen to me. And what we want to do is get into a place where we understand when we're managing risk that we're not looking at it alone. So it's not only from your individual perspective, and that's the value of when you're conducting enterprise risk management within your organization, that you have that cross-functional review. Because naturally, by virtue of our experience, we have a bias. And it's very much based on our experiences, how we were taught. Some of the same risks that we may be exposed to may create a natural bias. And the beauty of enterprise risk management, that holistic way of analyzing threats and looking at how you could enhance or grasp opportunities, the cross-functional view. So several times in our classes, when we would look at an issue and we have an input from the finance person, this is the input from the HR person, and you have those different sectors contributing their experience, you have different ways, you get different avenues by which you could either take up an opportunity or manage the risk, because everyone has a different way of looking at it. And our jobs as risk practitioners is not to think it's a solo job. Our job is to engage, teach, and reach out to those subject matter experts to get their point of view. And that's how we're going to have a rich system. That's what's going to help to build that culture. And it's very important that you identify a risk champion. That person who is going to be a beacon of light in your organization and is going to support you and help you build that culture. Without culture, you can't go very far with managing your risk. You have to get the culture right.
Thanks a lot, Kellee. And I would like to just wrap up this morning session with one thought, and that thought is risk management, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, it starts with you. And you have to look at yourself. We've been receiving comments this morning. We thank all of our participants for the comments that they've been making and some of the questions that you've asked. What we would like to say to you or ask you is, are you managing your own risks? Are you looking at yourself in the mirror? How would you answer the question? Are you following the quarantine protocols? Have you planned for what happens if you were to come down with a serious case of illness, including the current pandemic coronavirus? Are you talking about it? Because the adage that says, shoemaker has no shoes. As practitioners, don't or fail to adequately apply what we know and what we teach to ourselves. So risk management starts with you, and recognizing, one, you also need to apply it in your life, and two, as Kellee said, you have your biases. And the first step in dealing with biases, which we absolutely all have in some degree or another, we like to say why this person is like that or why that person is like that, and he's so and she's so, but we are also biased. Recognize your biases and understand that you have to adjust your decision making, recognizing that bias. So this has been, I think, a really interesting morning. There's a lot for us to unpack, and I know we need to go back and have a lot of conversation about some of the contributions that have been made so far. So we are going to take a break. We know that many of you have your your office calling, your emails to check, grab a bite to eat, and so on. And this afternoon, we're going to have one of those really, really packed, but we anticipate really exciting conversations. We have a diverse group of practitioners, academics, professionals, thought leaders, and we're going to talk about strategic risk, technology and innovation risk, and then risk leadership and governance. So, join us later this afternoon in about half an hour. We'll start at 12. Looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.